Thank you, Nicole, and good morning. So, how many pounds there? And how long?
22.
That's like a legal lingcod, you know? I couldn't resist. I got fishing on the brain because after the next service, Eric Hardy and I and Dave Taylor are going to drive down to San Diego this afternoon, get on a boat for 2.5 days, and hopefully catch a big tuna. So we'll see. So I should be in a good mood today, okay? We are continuing our series, Proclaiming His Excellencies, trying to figure out, because of all the incredible things God has done for us as His kids, trying to reflect together over the few months how we can pass this good news on to others in ways that's winsome and effective. And today, it's my delight to take you to Acts chapter 17, where Paul evangelizes a culture that is very, very different from the one he is familiar with, and it has very little common ground as far as any background in Judaism or Christianity. It's just more and more like our culture here today. So you have an outline in your bulletin. Hope you will take that out and follow along. And also, I'd like you in Acts 17, 18 in the Bible, because we're going to, near the end, we're going to move beyond what's in the outline into a little bit into the next chapter, Acts 18. And I had it here on, it was page, around page 926, 927. Yes, thanks, Bob. Appreciate that. When Paul goes into the synagogue and ministers to Jews, which is not what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at him out in the world ministering to Gentiles. When he goes into the synagogue and ministers to Jews, he has a lot of common ground with the people he's sharing Christ with. They have a shared narrative about who God is and what He's up to from their Old Testament background, their Jewish background. The people Paul shares with in the synagogue know that God is in the business of creating a community characterized by justice and mercy, where people treat each other the way God has treated them. All Paul really needs to do is add Jesus to the mix and challenge these Jews to recognize their Messiah has come and He's risen from the dead. He has a lot to start with. It's kind of like us. Back when I became a Christian in 1975, there was a pretty common Christian narrative in the United States of America and the West in general. It didn't mean everybody was a follower of Jesus by any means, but it meant that the story was a familiar one. So in my case, I came to Christ when I was 23 years old, but my parents had shipped me off to Sunday school from the time I was 5 till the time I was 12 and got my first surfboard, and they cut me loose. But I heard the story. I was living in the narrative of the story of God in the Bible and the Christian narrative and what God was like, kind of what His expectations for human beings were. And so when the gospel was shared with me as a 23-year-old, there was a point of reference. Well, that ain't the case anymore in our culture, is it? I mean, even at Biola, it's pretty amazing. We have kids from Christian homes, and in seminary as well. You talk to anybody that teaches out there, and people know less and less about the Bible, even people who are coming from churches. It's just not part of our narrative. I realize how far removed I am from this culture in my little bubble as a New Testament professor and as a pastor, when I hit my Google News every morning and kind of look at some of the headlines and this and that, and all this just wild stuff. The whole transgender bathroom stuff. We could go on and on about all the stuff that's out there that shows how far removed I am from the culture now, and how much more of a challenge it will be then for me to proclaim God's excellencies and get people up to speed on what the Bible has to say about God, about reality, about salvation, about Jesus. And I'm realizing how far removed I am even from my adult children and their spouses. Rachel's husband, Arnold, we had a gang up in Mammoth at the condo. We rent a condo up every year up there and take the family up there. So there's Rachel and her husband Arnold, and Becky and her husband Matt, and Margie and Joanna and I, and we just hang up there and we eat and we get out to the lake and fish a little bit and just enjoy life together for a couple of weeks. So one day we're driving back from the lake, and I remember Matt wasn't in the car. Matt and Becky were, I think, back at the condo, but Arnold and Rachel were in the car. I think Joanna was in the car. I can't remember if Margie was or not, but we're coming back from the lake, and we make this turn, and all of a sudden, Arnold's on his cell phone, which is the first sign that I'm culturally removed from my son-in-law because I don't own a cell phone. But Arnold says, I got him. And I'm going, you got him? And now, if you'd said that back at the lake, I'd have understood. What do you mean you got him? He got that guy, okay? Arnold was playing Pokemon Go or whatever it's called, okay? And we began to have this discussion, and Arnold educated me about something that he calls augmented reality, okay? Now, how many of you know that term? Some of you do. I didn't know that term. I don't need my reality augmented. It's challenging enough, okay? But there's augmented reality with these little creatures that, show up on street corners and this and that. It's just a different culture. Well, when Paul comes to the Areopagus and starts talking to these Gentile intellectuals, these Greek intellectuals, Paul is no longer in the synagogue. He is among people who don't have any background in the biblical narrative, who are totally immersed in a very, very different worldview. So he has to really strategize to build bridges with them. And there's such a lesson here for us and our ministry, our calling to proclaim the excellencies of God to the culture around us, because we have some serious bridge building to do and cultural analysis even to do to make sense of the gospel in the world in which we live. So we're going to go through and look at Paul's strategy. It's really pretty fun. It starts in verse 16 on your outline there. And what Paul's doing, he got chased out of Macedonia, Berea, Thessalonica up there, and left Timothy and Silas up there, and he's waiting for his missionary buddies down in Athens, Greece. And notice what it says in verse 16. It says, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city was full of idols. What starts Paul on this whole agenda is Paul is jealous for God's glory. Paul is jealous for God's glory, and has to start there with us. Do we really long for God to be made famous and get the glory that is his due? Well, boy, Paul did, and he was provoked by these idols, all these religious artifacts. So it says, verse 17, so he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, where he had more common ground, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. And then here's where it gets fun. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. We won't talk about Epicureanism and Stoicism. It'll kind of unpack as we go through here. But these are Greek intellectuals who really have no background, very little background in Judaism except what they see from a distance, and these folks disdain the Jews, and now along comes a Jew preaching something even different. And so that says, some said, what does this babbler wish to say? Others said, he seems to be a preacher of foreign deities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is you're presenting, for you bring some strange things to our ears. That shows just how far removed the gospel was from their culture, these strange things. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean. Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So at least Paul had an audience, okay? Now, what Paul does with this that's so informative for us is he doesn't start with Jesus. He starts by finding common ground with the people he's talking to. And in Paul's case, it happened to be religion. It's probably not going to be that for us, unless you happen to, say, have a coworker who's really into Eastern religion and all that kind of stuff. But notice what Paul does here, what he says here in verses 22 and 23. He says, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship. Paul is using very colorful language here. Just like in English, we have a word, I see, and then we have stronger words, I perceive, I observe. And these are not the regular words for see in the original language of the New Testament. They're words for, beholding and looking at. In fact, the second one takes the first word and adds extra letters to it. And the letters, interestingly enough, are the same letters that are added to the word born over in John 3 when Jesus tells Nicodemus, you must be born again, see? So the idea is here of Paul observing again and again and again, observing closely as some dictionaries translate this. Paul intentionally is looking around and finding a point of reference, a common ground, a place to start as he's going to share Jesus with these folks. And so he goes on and says, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. So Paul has just brilliantly found this common ground, and he's going to use this as a launching pad to share Christ. Now again, our common ground, as we seek to find common ground with folks who don't know Jesus, is probably not going to be religion. I mean, it might be, but in my experience, it's a variety of other things. I remember, for those of you who have school-age kids, I remember when our kids were in grammar school especially, Joanne spent hours and hours volunteering, working in the classroom, getting involved with these other young moms and their kids, because that, for these young moms, that was life. That was the what life was all about. And so talk about common ground. And when you find that kind of common ground with people, there's all these avenues for conversations about things that don't have anything to do with Jesus, that build the kind of relationships that allow you to talk about things that do have to do with Jesus as time unfolds. It might be hobbies. That's been the avenue that I've been able to leverage, whether it's fishing or this music stuff. I spent 5 hours jamming with some guys yesterday, and one of these guys is an awesome guy I met at Susie's Bar and Grill, and we spent all this time playing and talking about music, and these guys, we just talk about music forever, and it just builds a common ground that allows discussions to kind of morph into things that I would consider more important issues of life and eternity. And so there's just a variety of places we can find common ground with people, but it takes an intentionality to do so. It's been my observation over the years, I've been a believer, the better part of 40-some years now, that what spiritual entropy will do to you and I if we're not intentional about cultivating relationships with people who don't know Jesus is, I guarantee you, if you just allow spiritual entropy to have its course, your friends will all be Christians. And you'll be real happy and comfortable. But you'll be basically useless on this planet in the role God's called you to, proclaiming His excellencies, because you won't have anybody to proclaim those excellencies to. So there needs, no matter how busy we are, there needs to be an intentionality that blocks out time and energy and thinks, how can I develop common ground with people who don't know Jesus so that those relationships are there when crisis happens and the conversations drill down to things that really, really matter in an eternal sense. And that brings me to the second thing about common ground. Folks, we have common ground with non-Christians because of our common humanity. We're all part of a broken, hurting culture, and we all suffer, and we're not immune to suffering as Christians, and we see unbelievers suffer, and it's an incredible honor to enter into them, offer to pray for them, and this and that. I found these guys I play with over at Susie's. There's a guy who's a harmonica player, just the sweetest guy. I've been over to his house and chatted with him, and he's had this major challenges. It turns out in the last few months, both his brother and his sister and his brother-in-law, this couple, they're both diagnosed with terminal cancer at the same time. And they live back east in Michigan, and he and his wife have been making these trips back and forth. And what an opportunity to just be there and listen to him share and talk with him. Another guy, he's a bass player, kind of runs the jam, nicest guy, name is Sean, just a sweetheart. And he was wearing this T-shirt one day, and he had a picture of what I thought was a surfboard on it and some letters. And so I'm thinking, I chat with him about surfing. I go, hey, are you a retired surfer like I am? Because he didn't look like he was still surfing, you know. And he goes, oh, no, that's not a surfboard. Though the letters say MS, I have muscular sclerosis. And I started sharing with him about that, and that whole pilgrimage, started talking to him, and the more we talked, he just kind of opened up and he began to talk about his family. He's right in the middle of a legal battle with brothers, siblings, who have ripped him off for his parents' estate. And all this stuff Joanne and I have gone through with her brother and the estate, all of a sudden there's all this common ground to chat about things that are much more serious than, 3 chords, which chord to play on this blues song or whatever, and are getting down to where hopefully there'll be a chance to share Jesus down the line. So again, common ground, that's what we have to start with, but it takes an intentionality. And when I talk here about the human condition and the heartache we all share, and entering into that in the lives of people who don't know Jesus, I think that's part of Paul's strategy here in Acts 17. Here's why I say this. What does Paul do? He drills down to this one altar to the unknown God. And we have all kinds of historical evidence outside the Bible about altars to the unknown God in the ancient world. And we even have a literary reference to the ones in Athens. And I'm going to read an excerpt to you from this. It's from a guy named Diogenes who wrote something called The Lives of the Philosophers. And he's talking about a philosopher, prophet-type guy named Epimenides, and it just happens to relate to this deal in Athens and the unknown God. Listen to this story. He says, once when Athens was plagued by pestilence, he's talking about a plague that's killing people off. And of course, people in the ancient world, they didn't have antibiotics. When they had a plague that killed off half the city, what do? Well, they turn to their gods. They get desperate. And so he says, when this pestilence in the 6th century BC, the city rulers had exhausted all their strategies to abate it, they sent to the island of Crete asking the prophet Epimenides to come and help. Now listen to this. His remedy was to drive a herd of black and white sheep away from the Areopagus. This is the very place Paul's preaching this sermon in Acts 17. Drive a herd of black and white sheep away from the Areopagus, and then wherever they happen to lay down, to sacrifice them to the god of that place. And this guy writes, he says, the plague was stayed, and Diogenes says that, quote, memorial altars with no God's name inscribed on them may consequently be found throughout Greater Athens. So here is this altar to the unknown God, which is a total testimony of our brokenness, of our utter dependence on God when this plague came through, and the desperation of the Athenians to, where are these sheep going to sit? Let's set up an altar, let's sacrifice. And it just so happened the plague abated, and so that was a real point of reference. And so Paul goes right there in his wisdom and begins to talk about God. Now, what Paul doesn't do is begin to talk about Jesus. And he doesn't begin to rag on their immorality, their pagan immorality. These people, their worldview was such that it wouldn't have done any good to say, oh, you guys are really immoral. You need to clean up your lives and start to go to church on Sunday morning. No. Where Paul had to start, until they understood the character of God and what God was really like, they were not going to be able to look at themselves, acknowledge their own need for God, their own sin, and recognize how they stood in the face of God. See, in the Greco-Roman world, you couldn't say, be holy, because I am holy. God couldn't say that because the Greco-Roman gods were at each other's throats. They were treacherous, all those myths. So there was no morality tied to religion in the Greco-Roman world. Any sense of morality was tied to the understanding of the city-state and other issues. It's kind of a social contract. It wasn't tied to religion. So the first thing Paul has to do is deal with worldview, totally reconstruct their worldview. And he does it in a remarkable way. Look at there at verse 24. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. He's going to reconstruct their whole worldview. Nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Talking about finding common ground. Here he's quoting from their own literature to build his case for the Judeo-Christian God, okay? Verse 29, being then God's offspring, we ought not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. Now again, what Paul is doing here, he's going after a whole issue of worldview. The morality issue, that'll take care of itself when I understand who God is. And I want to give you just a glimpse. I don't want you to take notes on this part of the message. There's no blanks to fill in. You want this stuff later, you can hit me up, email me, and I'll give you the PowerPoint, no problem. But one year when we were going through Acts, many moons ago, I was assigned this passage, and I preached a sermon and looking at if this was all we knew about God, if we didn't have the rest of the Bible, but all we had was Paul's sermon to the Areopagus, and the Areopagus here to the Greeks, and this, what could we learn about God? And I'm going to give you some bullet point summaries. It's just remarkable to see how much Paul taught them and how much he reconstructed their worldview in this short paragraph here. So as we go through here, I'm going to read to phrases from this passage we just read on your outline, and you can kind of follow along with the phrases. And then I'm going to give you kind of the theological categories that Paul is unpacking in this. It's just really rather amazing. So the first thing Paul does is he's going to tell them what God is like. He's going to tell them what God does too, all in just this short paragraph. First of all, in verse 24, he says that God is the Lord of heaven and earth. The Lord of heaven and earth. Well, a theologian would say that means God is sovereign, right? Lord of heaven and earth, God is sovereign. Those of you who are familiar with that little book we give to our new members, Bible Doctrine or some other theology book, will recognize that these are standard topics from a systematic theology, and the way Paul has contextualized this stuff and packaged it is just remarkable. The second thing we discover, Paul says that God doesn't live in temples made by man. We shouldn't think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, okay? God is spirit. He doesn't have a body. He's not made of stuff. And so what do we call this? Well, God is incorporeal, pronounce it ever how you want. It means he doesn't have a body. God is spirit. And you will find that in your theology books as one of the descriptions of the attributes of God. Paul continues. This is just fun stuff. He is actually not far from each one of us. Well, we call that the immanence of God, that God is close. God is not simply off in heaven and wound things up like a clock and let it run from a distance or left it up to chance, as the Epicurean philosophers would have argued that Paul's talking to here. And then he says, nor is God served by human hands as if he needed anything. One of the basic realities of the God of the Bible is God is self-sufficient. He doesn't need you. He doesn't need me. In his grace and mercy and wisdom, he has invited us to be part of his story and he uses us as part of his plan, but he don't need us. He is just fine, just as a wonderful, full Trinitarian community, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit for all eternity. So, Paul gets all that in there. He isn't done. Check this out. What God does. It says in verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it. Verse 26, he made from one man every nation of mankind. So God creates. Verse 25, he himself gives to all mankind breath and everything. God provides. Verse 28, in him we live and move and have our being. God sustains. This is a cool one. It says elsewhere that he holds everything together by the word of his mouth. The idea here is that if God withdrew his presence from the universe, all the molecules and the protons and the atoms and the hootons and whatever they are would just kind of crumble down into chaos. It's the order God brings to the universe. And David Taylor, on the way to San Diego, I'm going to expect our rocket scientists to explain all that to me, okay? So we've had some great conversations over the years. But at any rate, so finally, God controls. Notice what Paul says, that God's determined the allotted periods and the boundaries of our dwelling places, the nations and this and that. So you begin to see just the brilliance of Paul just kind of giving them a biblical worldview. And then once you understand who God is, all of a sudden, it's kind of like a mirror. You get a picture of who you are that then allows you to begin to be aware of your need before God and really who we aren't. You know, we think we are gods and the captain of our fate and all this kind of stuff, and all of a sudden you realize, wow, if this is what God is like, I better listen to what this guy has to say. And so then Paul finally ends with Jesus. Paul got here in a few paragraphs. For most of us, it's going to take us years cultivating relationships with people to really earn the right to be heard and share the gospel. But it's worth every moment of it. Paul says now, the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. And so Paul gets right to the heart of it and talks about judgment and Jesus' role in final judgment. Now, we have a culture that likes to hear about the love of God maybe, but doesn't really care to hear about judgment. In fact, it's a real bad scene to judge anybody, isn't it? Or is it? All you got to do is look at what is going on out in the media right now to know that God has so wired into us the belief that there ought to be accountability for our actions and judgment in the final analysis. What's going on with this quarterback of the 49ers? Oh, they're laying into him, rightly or wrongly, whatever. What about this fellow Brock Turner, okay? This Stanford guy who raped an unconscious woman and was given a 6-month sentence and is now out after 3 months. And the public is, and I think rightfully so, outraged at the injustice of our justice system. Deep down inside, folks, we know that a human race, a society without judgment and accountability for our actions is utter chaos. And that's one of the things that keeps us whole as a human race, as a society. And so, again, Paul can pack so much into a few words. Notice, judgment is scheduled. There's a fixed a day. There's a day. It's scheduled. God has fixed a day. It is universal. All people everywhere, Paul tells us. It is going to be fair. Finally, the scales of justice will be set. Jesus will judge in righteousness, and it is personal by a man whom God has appointed. And that man is Jesus. It's guaranteed that he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. And here comes the resurrection again. The historicity of the resurrection, historical, Jesus rising from the dead as the linchpin of the gospel. And Paul drills all the way down. Now, that's not the whole story, obviously, and we wonder, did Paul say more? Luke's messages are summaries. They're not word-for-word recordings of what of these messages that we see throughout the book of Acts. But we get quite a picture here of Paul's strategy as he is trying to build bridges to a culture that is very, very different and that doesn't have any background in the message that he's sharing. Now, finally, we watch God work, right? We watch God work. And actually, God didn't work very much here, and we'll talk about that. Okay? He worked some, but we don't see Paul leave a church in Athens. Interesting. Look what happens. It says, when they heard of the resurrection from the dead, some mocked. So you have mockery. And that's what we find the same reaction to the message of the gospel in our own culture. But there were some, it says, others said, we will hear you again about this. So there was a group of people where there was some curiosity, wasn't there? And then finally, Paul went out of their midst, but some men, Luke tells us, joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius, the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with him. So We had mockery, we had curiosity, we had faith. And we talked about this when we went through the parable of the sower together some weeks back, that we sow the seed of the Word of God, and there's going to be various reactions depending on what is going on in people's hearts. Now, I mentioned that Paul wasn't real successful here. In fact, it's very interesting. This is the most culturally thoughtful message Paul preaches throughout the book of Acts. The apologetics, the care he went into it. And this is why I took the time to unpack all the theology, all the doctrine of God that he packs into this thing. It's really remarkable to see how Paul starts with this unknown God stuff and just really taps into these people and their, kind of their felt needs and the human condition, and then builds a whole case for worldview, what the Judeo-Christian God is like, and then gets to Jesus. It's a remarkable apologetic is what it is. And yet, it's from all the places Paul preaches, it's his least successful message. There is, again, no church that gets planted in Athens, just a few converts, a handful, maybe at most. And so there's been a lot of stuff written about this. Some people have said, look, Paul was a failure here. And the lesson here is don't throw your pearls before swine. Let's not waste our time with the cultural elites and the intellectuals. They're not going to respond to the gospel. And let's not use apologetics and logic. Look at all the effort Paul went to package this thing logically and thoughtfully, and what good did it do? We just need to share the gospel and pray and trust God to take care of the results. Well, there's obviously some truth to that, but the problem with that, dismissing this sermon as a failure, is there's no indication anywhere in Luke's narrative that he is sharing this story as a story of how not to share Christ. And as to logic, oh my goodness, I preached through the Peter's sermon in Acts 2, the first Christian sermon, and I remember studying that thing and just being blown away. You first reading just reads like a bunch of verses from the Old Testament Peter's throwing out. But you start to unpack the logic of what Peter's doing. It is such a thoughtful, logical presentation of salvation history to the Jews in Peter's audience. There's no problem with logic. There's no problem with what Paul's doing. But there is a lesson to be learned here as we watch what happens, because it had to be discouraging to Paul not to see a church planted in Athens. And the discouragement doesn't stop when he moves on to Corinth. And that's why I want you in Acts 18 as we move on here and wrap things up. In Acts 18, notice what happens. Again, Paul leaves Athens. There's no church there, a few converts. Acts 18:1, after this, Paul left Athens and he went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all of the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. Verse 4, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. Now look at the reaction, verse 5. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, no success. He shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. I find that very curious. He didn't have a whole lot of luck with the Gentiles in Athens. And now he's been reviled by the Jews, and he's turning back to the Gentiles. And you got to imagine, he's not at his most optimistic and hopeful place in his career as a missionary at this particular juncture, if you want to kind of get into his head. And this brings us to the last part of your outline, and it's really, if you're going to take away something, this is probably the most important thing to take away today. That and the building bridges, the intentionality of building bridges with people who don't know Jesus. But one of the things we have not emphasized enough in this sermon series is the centrality of prayer and the reality that if somebody is going to come to Christ, it is going to be a work of God and not a work of Mark and Casey Schramm or Joe Hellerman or Ben and Christine Ho. That this, folks, is a supernatural God thing. And we need to be falling on our face before the Lord and acknowledging that again and again and being sensitive to the movement of the Spirit in the lives of the people we interact with. So I just have three final kind of thoughts. One is, when I proclaim His excellencies, I won't convince everyone. You guys know that, right? That's probably who knows? I mean, I didn't, last night, got into a little conversation at the end of the jam session with my guitar playing brother. He's far from convinced, okay? But here's what I want us to come to grips with today. I won't convince anyone. I won't convince anyone. Oh, man, you can study Paul's sermon at the Areopagus, and you can frame, and you can plan what you're going to say, and you should be prepared to give a defense. But all that preparation and planning and logic and organization, you're not going to convince anyone with that, but God will convince someone. God will convince someone. And I want you to see what happens now as Acts 18 unfolds. Here is Paul, probably pretty discouraged. The Greeks haven't responded. Now the Jews chased him out of the synagogue, basically. And look what happens. And this is just a God thing. Acts 18, verse 5, it says, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, we looked at that part. I'm down on verse 7, okay? So Paul leaves the synagogue. He goes to a house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. That means this guy's a Greek who had been around the synagogue hearing about the Jewish God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Then, lo and behold, God will convince someone. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord, this is the beautiful part, said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. For, look at this phrase here, I have many people, many in this city who are my people. I have many in this city who are my people. You know what God's telling Paul? There are people out there, they're mine. You just need to share the gospel, and they're going to respond. What a cool, cool thing. And that's basically what Jesus has said to us as He sent us off in the Great Commission to proclaim God's excellencies to the world around us. God has His people, and we need to be faithful to pray that He works in their hearts and that we have the sensitivity to know who they are and to notice the movement of the Spirit in their lives. It occurred to me as I was working on this sermon, and I even have a little section in something I'm writing to this end, that, as we walk with Jesus as members of Oceanside Christian Fellowship, if you're like me, you long to, leave this place and not just Sunday morning for an hour, but, Monday through Saturday, experience God's presence in your life. And it seems to me, as I look at the early Christians, God's presence is tied to God's priorities. So Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations. And then He says, and I am with you always to the end of the age. Jesus says in Acts 1, the Holy Spirit will come upon you and you will be my witnesses. God says to Paul here in Corinth, I will be with you, and I have many people in the city. And if we want to experience the fullness of God in our own lives, we put ourselves where God's priorities are, out watching God and His Spirit work in the lives of people who need Jesus and make ourselves available to be His vessels to be used in their lives. Let's pray.